Ladies and gentlemen, today, I don't bring you a message wrapped in comfort. I bring you the story of resilience, raw, unapologetic, and inconvenient to many in power. This isn't about politics. This is about people. It's about dignity. It's about the kind of courage that refuses to kneel even when every superpower on Earth is trying to force you down. Let me ask you something uncomfortable. What would you do if the entire world turned against you? I don't mean being disliked by your colleagues or blocked by your ex on social media. I mean global superpowers turning their artillery, their propaganda machines, their financial systems, and their diplomatic cold shoulders all towards you. I mean facing sanctions that cut off your oxygen, drones that hover over your sky, and lies that circulate faster than facts. That's not a press conference, that's war by every other name. That's what Iran faced, and yet it didn't shatter. When you are pushed to the wall, when every door is shut and every ally turns their back, that's when most bend, most break, most beg. But not Iran. You see, it's in that precise moment when the pressure is at its peak, when the cost of standing up becomes unbearable, that a nation or a person discovers something far more powerful than any weapon, inner strength. Iran stood there, battered and bruised, not with tanks or tweets, but with something far rarer, resolve. And here's the reality people find hard to digest. It's easy to show strength when you're celebrated, supported, and surrounded by comfort. But it's only when you're completely cornered that you meet the real version of yourself. It's a universal truth, whether you're a country or an individual. Pressure reveals character, hardship exposes spine, isolation clarifies loyalty. They thought if they squeezed Iran hard enough, it would crumble into submission. But like coal under pressure, something else happened. It turned to diamond. They were expecting collapse. What they got was clarity. The kind of clarity that doesn't come from committee meetings or UN resolutions. It comes from pain. And pain, when embraced with dignity, transforms into power. People underestimate what being pushed to the wall really means. They think it's the end of options, but often it's the beginning of transformation. When your back hits that wall, when you're bleeding, mocked, and abandoned, you don't just find your strength, you become it. Iran's courage didn't come from parades or politics. It came from necessity, from survival, from refusing to be humiliated. And here's the most unsettling part of all this for those who still don't understand why Iran didn't break. They weren't prepared for a nation that wasn't afraid to lose comfort in order to keep it. Honor, that's where most fold. That's where powerhouses collapse from within. But Iran stared directly into the eyes of the storm, not because it wanted a fight, but because it refused to die on its knees. And if there's a lesson in this, it's not about Iran alone. It's about you, about anyone who's ever been betrayed, beaten down, outnumbered, or overlooked. Next time life corners you, don't see it as defeat. See it as the moment the world will finally meet who you really are. Let me challenge everything you think you know about power. Because real power, it isn't loud, it isn't always on a battlefield, it isn't in a speech. Real power is dignity. Quiet, unwavering, priceless dignity. And the moment you understand that, you stop fearing the loss of material things. Because what defines a person or a nation isn't how much they possess, it's what they refuse to surrender. They tried to break Iran. Not just with bombs or sanctions, but with humiliation, stripping layers of sovereignty, mocking its culture, challenging its pride on the world stage. But here's where things get interesting. Iran didn't retaliate by begging for favor or playing the victim. It fought for something far greater than resources or reputation. It fought for dignity. And that is a currency the world's superpowers don't understand. You can freeze bank accounts. You can cripple imports. You can even isolate a nation diplomatically. But what do you do when the people you're trying to crush refuse to be ashamed of who they are? That's not just defiance, that's danger to any system built on control, because dignity, you can't bomb it. You can't buy it, you can't bend it unless the person holding it lets go, and Iran never did, let's be honest. We live in a time where people trade their integrity for applause, where nations shift their morals depending on profit margins. But every once in a while, there's a story that slaps the world awake, and this is one of them. Iran chose honor over convenience, identity over acceptance, and that, in a world obsessed with conformity, is nothing short of revolutionary. Here's what no one wants to admit. It's easy to stay noble when the world applauds you. But try keeping your head high when everyone's calling you the enemy. Try protecting your principles when it costs you everything. That's what Iran did. That's where dignity lives, not in peace, but in pressure. It reminds me of something chillingly powerful. When you know what you stand for, the threats around you start losing their grip. Iran didn't panic. It didn't dissolve. It endured. And in doing so, it reminded the world of something we've all quietly forgotten, that dignity is the ultimate act of rebellion. So, when they came to break Iran, they weren't just challenging borders or nuclear talks. They were trying to strip away the one thing that makes a people ungovernable, self-respect. And when Iran stood up and said, "You will not define us," the world didn't just witness a political moment. It witnessed a moral one, and here's where it hits home for you. When life demands you give up your values for survival, don't. Because dignity, once surrendered, is nearly impossible to reclaim. But when it's defended, when it's guarded like a nation's last breath, it doesn't just survive. It inspires. Respect is never handed to you. It's earned in the darkest hours, in the loneliest moments, when no one is watching, and you stand anyway. That's when the world starts to pay attention. You see, the irony here is that the very forces that sought to destroy Iran's reputation may have ended up doing the opposite. Because the more Iran was demonized, the more defiantly it stood. And that defiance, whether you agree with its politics or not, forced the world to look again. It forced even the most skeptical observers to admit, they're not bowing, they're not breaking, and in a time when most fold for convenience, that refusal alone demands respect. Let's not kid ourselves. This isn't about popularity contests. Iran didn't set out to win the world's approval. In fact, the opposite happened. The more pressure mounted, the more isolated it became, the more unshakable its stance grew. Not because of arrogance, but because it had something too few possess. Conviction, and make no mistake, conviction is magnetic. It may not make headlines at first, it may not trend, but eventually people take notice. And slowly, what was once called defiance starts to be recognized for what it really is, strength. Unfiltered, inconvenient, undeniable strength. There's something deeply uncomfortable for world leaders and media pundits about a nation that simply won't comply. Because when you expect surrender and get steel instead, it disrupts your narrative. Iran's refusal to conform wasn't just an act of national pride. It was a mirror held up to the world. A mirror that asked, what do you stand for? Would you hold your line under this pressure? Or would you sell your values to save your skin? And here's what matters. When the dust begins to settle, people remember those who didn't flinch. History doesn't revere the agreeable. It doesn't immortalize the ones who bowed down to avoid discomfort. It remembers the ones who stood loudly or silently, but firmly. You can despise a country's policies. You can question its leaders, but what you can't ignore is a people's refusal to be broken. And when that resistance is constant, deliberate, and unshaken, even enemies take note. That's the paradox the world now faces. They came to break Iran, but the harder they pushed, the more global respect it quietly gathered. Not through military might, not through diplomacy, but through sheer, relentless resolve. And let's take a step back from geopolitics for a moment. Apply this to yourself. People will try to pressure you, define you, corner you, but if you can hold your ground calmly, fiercely, without theatrics, you will gain something money can't buy. Respect, because in the end, The world doesn't respect weakness masked as civility. It respects those who hold the line when holding it costs everything. Do you know what truly separates the powerful from the pretenders? It's what they do in silence when no one's watching, when no one's helping, and when the spotlight has completely vanished. Iran didn't just survive isolation, it evolved in it, and that fact alone unsettles its critics more than any speech ever could. You see, people often equate isolation with weakness, with decay, with decline, but sometimes it's in that very loneliness that the strongest foundations are built. Iran was cut off economically, diplomatically, technologically. The world expected collapse. But what they didn't expect was that the very isolation meant to break, Iran ended up becoming its greatest incubator of strength. This is where most people and nations go wrong. They view solitude as punishment, as a failure of diplomacy or personality. But Iran used it as a crucible. When trade routes were blocked, they innovated internally. When outside alliances failed, they turned to domestic unity. When they couldn't import solutions, they created them. That's not just resilience, that's reinvention. And this applies to every one of us when life isolates you, when friends vanish, when support systems dry up, when the world feels impossibly cold, most people panic. But the ones who endure, the ones who come out the other side sharper, stronger, more focused, they don't treat isolation as exile. They treat it as education. Iran didn't fall into despair. It focused, it recalibrated, and it reminded the world that solitude doesn't weaken character. It exposes it. Because when the noise fades, when you're forced to face your own voice without distraction, what you find in that silence defines everything that comes next. We live in a culture addicted to attention. If something's not visible, it's assumed to be irrelevant. But Iran proved that what's being built in the shadows often outlasts what's broadcasted in the spotlight. And it's deeply unsettling to powerful nations to realize that the more they tried to isolate Iran, the more self-reliant it became. Not dependent, not diminished, but deliberately forged into something even more formidable. So here's the uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the best thing that can happen to you is being left alone. Not because you deserve it, but because in that stillness you meet the rawest version of yourself and decide what to do with it. Iran didn't waste its solitude, it weaponized it. It turned restriction into resourcefulness, pressure into persistence. And now, the very forces that tried to silence it are being forced to acknowledge what they unintentionally created. A nation that refuses to be dictated to. And for anyone listening who's ever felt sidelined, excluded, or underestimated, remember this. The moment you stop needing the crowd to hear your voice is the moment your voice becomes dangerously powerful. You don't have to invade to make an impact. You don't have to dominate headlines to shift the narrative. Sometimes all it takes is standing still, refusing to move, refusing to bend, while the world tries to push you over. That's what Iran did. It didn't storm borders. It didn't seek to conquer lands. It simply held its ground. And in doing so, it sent shockwaves far beyond its own soil. Without moving an inch, it forced global powers to reconsider their approach, their arrogance, their assumptions. That's not noise, that's gravity. People think shaking the world means shouting louder, bombing bigger, boasting endlessly. But Iran proved something that very few nations ever managed to demonstrate. That presence, unshakable, dignified, disciplined presence, is sometimes the most powerful weapon of all. The mistake most powerful entities make is assuming that pressure always results in submission. That if you isolate someone long enough, sanction them hard enough, and paint them as villains long enough, they'll break. But Iran didn't, and in refusing to crumble, it rewrote the rulebook. The world expected fear. What they got was focus. They expected desperation. What they saw was determination. And here's the thing, they didn't know what to do with it. Because strength that doesn't roar, that doesn't brag, that doesn't need validation, terrifies people. It's unpredictable, it's unshakable, and it's undeniably powerful. Let's cut through the noise for a moment. Iran didn't need to invade to make the earth tremble. It only needed to stay standing while every tool of global pressure was thrown its way. That posture of unwavering conviction became a political and psychological earthquake, because it forced even its adversaries to reckon with the question, what if they can't be broken, and that question, when asked behind closed doors in war rooms and diplomatic halls, carried more weight than 1,000 declarations. That question keeps powerful people up at night, because it introduces a dangerous idea that there are still people, still nations, who value principle over profit, honor over convenience, identity over imitation. Iran stood on its soil and said in no uncertain terms, we will not be defined by your headlines, and that act alone, whether you agree with their governance or not, created a global ripple. Because suddenly, a narrative carefully crafted by powerhouses began to unravel not through argument, but through action, or rather, through restraint. The lesson here is piercing. You don't need to chase the world to move it. You only need to stand so solidly in who you are that the world has no choice but to adjust around you. Because when you stop flinching, stop performing, stop pandering, you become more than a voice, you become an anchor. You become a force, and in that force, even without crossing a single border, you shake the very ground that others thought you'd never stand on again. What happens when you walk alone, not because you want to, but because the world has turned its back on you? Most crumble, most compromise, most water themselves down just to belong, just to be accepted by the powerful, by the popular, by the ones with influence. But Iran didn't, and that, whether you like it or not, is exactly what made the world stop and stare. Iran walked alone, for years, isolated, misunderstood, vilified, and yet it walked straight, no begging. No apologies, no performance, just silent, stubborn conviction, and that's where the lesson lies, not in politics, but in principle. You don't need the world's approval to be right. You don't need applause to be dignified. You don't need a crowd behind you to keep walking forward. What you need, what Iran embodied in its most pressured moment, is conviction, that immovable belief that even if everyone walks away, you will not walk away from yourself. Let me be blunt, most people are terrified of being alone. Nations too, they'll bend their values, betray their roots, just to be welcomed back into the room, just to get a seat at the table. Iran, on the other hand, stood outside the room and built its own table. Not because it was proud, but because it was principled. And let's be very clear, that takes guts. It's easy to chant slogans when you're surrounded by allies. But when you're outnumbered, outspent, and outshouted, standing firm becomes a revolution in itself. This is what people don't talk about enough, the price of conviction, because it does cost. You lose comfort. You lose reputation. You lose invitations to the global party. But what you gain is something no negotiation can offer identity a clear, unshakable sense of who you are. Iran didn't crumble in isolation. It sharpened. It clarified its priorities. It leaned on self-reliance, and while the world labeled it rogue, it quietly turned inward, adapted, survived, and in many ways outlasted the narrative meant to destroy it. There's a powerful message here for anyone who's ever felt left out, shut out, or cast aside for standing by their beliefs. Don't chase approval. It's the most expensive drug on the market, and the least satisfying. Instead, invest in conviction. Because when the applause dies, when the support evaporates, and you're left alone with your choices, it's only conviction that keeps your spine straight. The world will always have something to say about you, sometimes flattering, often unfair. But if you can walk with your head high, knowing you stood for something when it wasn't easy, then you've already won. And like Iran, you'll realize something profound. When you no longer need validation to act, you become more powerful than those demanding your silence.